In this screencast, we're going to finish off creating the directive that we started in the previous screencast. This is the template that we created for our directive in the previous screencast. It's a little more complex than just an input element, but it will give us all of the functionality that we need for both our new contact form and our edit contact form. So now that we have the template, we have to go to our directives.js file, which we created in the last screencast. And in this file, we're going to actually create the brain, if you will, behind our Angular directive. So we have to create a directive block here, and the name of our directive is going to be form field. Now this function will need to take two values. The first is timeout, which is the Angular way to use the set timeout function. You might recall that I mentioned in the previous screencast, we'll be using set timeout when we call this update method. And so we're going to need to require that. The other thing we're going to need to require is the field types. And this is this Angular value that we just created right up above this. Now, an Angular directive block like this returns an object with a bunch of properties that we're going to fill in now. The first value is restrict, and this is restricting it to the ways that we can allow this directive to be used. An Angular directive can be used either as a new element, as an attribute on that element, as a class on that element, or as a comment. We're going to restrict this to just being used as an element or an attribute. Now, you might recall in our new .html form, we're using it as an element here, but because we're allowing it to be used as an attribute, we could go ahead and create, say, a div with a form field attribute instead if we'd wanted to. The next and another very important property is the template URL, views/formfield.html. Then we'll have replace, which we'll set to true. What this means is that the HTML that we have here in form field will actually replace this attribute here. If we did not have replace, it would default to false, and that would mean that this HTML would be placed inside this form field element. So it would all go in there. Next, we need to add the scope property, which is actually an object of itself. And this is a very important property. This is where we choose what attributes that are placed on this element here are going to be available inside of the actual directive. Now, as you know, all four of these are important: record, field, live, and required. We need to be able to access these from inside of our directive. But how do we get those values? And also, what exactly are those values? Because if you think about it, contact here is a reference to an object that we have in our controller, scope.contact. However, first name here is just a string. It doesn't actually reference anything. We just need it as a string so that we can get the value within contact and use it to create our label and that type of thing. So these are going to have different types of scope bindings. And this is how we do this. First of all, we want to have record, and record we're just going to set with an equal sign. Now this is important. What this means is that this is a two-way binding. So any changes that we make to the record object from within this directive are actually being made to this contact object out here, to the record object, or as it's called outside of this directive, the contact object out here. So that means when we update the first name attribute inside our directive, it will update out here in this controller. That's very important. Now for the other three, field, live, and required, these don't actually have to update or change outside. We just need to be able to read these. And so we'll use a one-way binding. And this is, we'll have field, and we show this with the @ sign. So we have field, we have live, and we also have required. And these are all just @ signs to show that we don't need to be able to save back to them. Now the last value here is a link function. And this function takes the scope for this directive. It also takes the element for this directive and any attributes that were on this directive as well, although we're only going to be using the scope in here. And basically this link function is run during the creation of this directive, and it allows us to modify exactly what goes on when the directive is created and replaces the content that is here. Now we're only going to be using this link function to add some other values to the scope here. So for example, the field types that we have up here, these need to be available within the directive template, right? So that we can create our messages down below. So that means we need to add them to the scope. So we'll say scope, and you know what? I'm going to change this to $scope so that it feels more like working with inside a controller, because that's kind of what we're doing here. We're using this link function like a controller inside this directive. So we can say scope.types equal field types. And of course that's available because we imported it right here. Now let's look back here. We also need a remove method, right? Because we want to allow our users to remove fields that are not required. So let's go ahead and do scope.remove, and this takes the field name as a property, and we can go ahead and say $scope.record, which references this right up here. And then we can say square bracket field, and actually what we want to do is use the delete in front of it there. And then we're also going to do $scope.blurUpdate. And we're going to write that function next, because blurUpdate is the function that actually performs the update if our directive is not a live directive. So what we can do is say if $scope.live is not equal to false. Now, unfortunately, we have to say, is it not equal to false, because this is a string. It's not actually a Boolean value. So we have to say scope.live is not equal to false. We'll assume it's then supposed to be true, and we can go ahead and proceed with the update. So we'll do $scope.record. Remember, this is the contact value, and we can say $update, and we'll take a callback function here. And when we call the update function, what this does is send our record back to the server and update it, and we'll get the updated value back. And so we can have our updated record in return, and we'll just go ahead and reassign that. So we have scope.record equals updated record. There we go. So this is how we will actually go ahead and perform our update. This blur update function will also be called with the ngBlur directive on our input element here. So the last thing we have to write is the update method, which will be called whenever the input element is changed. And so let's come down here. We'll write that down here. First of all, we need to create a save timeout variable here, which will be used over multiple callings of this function. So we'll say scope.update. So we're going to begin by doing $timeout, which you might recall we pulled in at the beginning of our directive here. This is how we can interact with the timeout methods within Angular. So we'll say timeout.cancel, and we're canceling save.timeout. And you'll see why in a second, because right after this, we're going to set save timeout equal to $timeout, and we're going to pass it $scope.blurUpdate and 1000 for 1 second. This function will be called every time our user types a character into a field. So if you think about it, if they're writing their name, they're going to write A, and then right away this will be called, and a timeout will be set. And in 1 second, the timeout will be called. But then they go ahead and write N, and then this function is called again. So that first timeout is canceled, and a new one is called for 1 second after the N was typed. And so that way, if our user when a user types their name, so for example, Andrew, they're going to type each letter probably less than a second between each letter. And so once they finish though, they'll stop typing, the second will happen, and then the update will occur. All right, well, believe it or not, that is all we need to do for our directive. So we have written the entire template that our directive requires. We have written the code behind our directive. We have put our directive into our form field here. There's one last step that we actually need to do, and that is go to public/main, and we need to add our directives file here. So I'll copy this bottom one here and change this to source/directives. So now we can go to localhost/contact/new, and you can see we have our first name element showing up here just fine. That's great. And so we should actually be able to see our validation in practice. If we go ahead and begin to type my name, and then if I remove it all, notice it turns red, and we have at the end here, first name is required. But then if I start to type again, the validation error is removed. Now, actually, now that I think about it, one thing we forgot to do, if I refresh the page here, and if I click create contact, notice nothing happens. If I open up the console here, you can see we have no errors. We can't create a contact and nothing's going on. Now, you might recall, if we look back at our code here in our controllers, the problem is new contact is invalid because first name is required, but there's nothing being filled in. And so we're broadcasting this record invalid message, but we forgot over here in our directive that we have to listen for that and mark our element as invalid. So back in our link function here, let's do this right at the top. We'll say $scope.$on, and we're listening for the record invalid function. When that happens, then what we need to do is set our $scope square bracket $scope.field. And this here refers to this ngForm attribute, or the fake form element that we're creating inside of this directive. And we want to go ahead and do $set dirty. It will mark our first name field here as dirty. And since it's dirty, it's already invalid because it's empty. But since the user didn't try to type anything in, it's considered pristine and not dirty. And so we'll set it to dirty, and that will mark it so that the user can then see the problem. So if we refresh the page now, and I go ahead and click create contact, notice that first name is required. However, if I type in the name, the error disappears. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the rest of our attributes here. Let's go back to our new template here. I'm going to go ahead and copy this again, and we're going to have this for last name. And last name is going to be exactly the same because last name is also required. The last thing we want to do is do form-field for record contact. But actually before record here, let me do ng-repeat. And we want to repeat this for every key and value in record, because remember, record comes with all of these valid keys and values, and we want to actually show these. So, and actually that should not be record, that should be contact, because we are now outside of this form field directive code. For every key and value in contact, we'll set the record to contact, we will set the field to the key. And there we go. So now, if we come back and refresh this page, we should see exactly what we want. Now, notice two things here. First of all of these values here are not required. Only first name and last name have the required attribute, and so they do not have our X button at the end. So notice how our ng switch attribute is coming in handy here. If it's required, we only show the input element, first name and last name here. But if it is not required, we show this input group here, which is both the input element and this button at the end. Now there's one more thing to take note of here, and that is that first name and last name are showing up twice here, and actually they are linked up. So if I write Andrew up here, notice that Andrew is written down here. And if I go ahead and edit it down here, it's being edited up there. So that's good that it's being changed in both places at once, but even better would be first name and last name not showing up in this field down here. And so what we have to do is, where we loop over our contact here, we have to filter out first name and last name. Now, unfortunately, Angular does not have a built-in way for us to filter objects by their keys. However, this will not be a hard filter to write. So let's open up our public source filter.js file, and let's write another filter here. We're going to call this filter, we'll call it key filter. And the way this works, as you know, we return a function here, and this function is going to take an object and a query. And the way we're going to use this is we're going to say contact, pipe it through key filter, and the key filter will take the query, for example, first name, right? And so first name here is that query, but the object is contact, the one that we're piping into the key filter. And so basically what we need to do is return a new object that does not have the key that was set here. What we can do is say var result equals an empty object, and then we can do angular.forEach, and we'll loop over the object, and the function we pass it can take it takes the value first, and then it takes a key. And so we can say if the key does not equal the query, then we go ahead and assign it to result. So we'll say result square bracket key equals the value. And so we'll loop over like that. And then at the bottom here, we just return the result. In here, we can go ahead and say key filter by first name, and then let's go ahead and do it again, key filter for last name. So we're filtering for both first name and last name. And now if we come back to our form and refresh it, you can see we have first name and last name at the top, but none of those values down beneath. Let's make sure our remove buttons are working. If I click it on address, you can see it disappears, and that's just fine. Let's go ahead and create an actual contact here. I'll say John Doe, and we'll give him an email of john@doe.com. Notice the validation working as we type. And now let's go ahead and click create contact. Excellent. So that contact was created. We were sent back to our /contacts page. And notice right here, we have John Doe, a new contact. So there you go. We have successfully created the new contact form.